The air in the courtroom was thick enough to choke on, a stale mix of cheap disinfectant and collective anxiety. All eyes were on 17-year-old Darius, his lanky frame swallowed by an ill-fitting suit. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. Across the room, Officer Miller sat beside the prosecutor, his uniform crisp, his expression a mask of civic duty. But Darius saw the flicker in his eyes, the same cold glint he'd seen under the strobing red and blue lights in that dark alley. The judge's voice droned on, a meaningless sound in the face of the lie that was suffocating him. "Mr. Jackson," the judge prompted, his voice impatient, "do you have anything to say?" Darius's gaze locked with Miller's. His voice, when it came, was a raw, trembling whisper that cracked the silence. He raised a shaking hand, his finger pointing directly at the decorated officer. "He's lying." The scent of rain-soaked asphalt and sizzling onions from a street vendor's cart usually meant home for Darius Jackson. It was the smell of the South Side, a place of cracked sidewalks and vibrant murals, of rumbling bass from passing cars, and the laughter of kids playing stickball in the street. But tonight, the familiar smells were laced with something else, something acrid and metallic that clung to the back of his throat. Fear. He clutched the worn strap of his backpack, the weight of his calculus textbook a poor anchor in the storm brewing inside him. Just an hour ago, he'd been under the fluorescent hum of the library, tutoring a freshman in algebra, the familiar comfort of numbers and equations a shield against the chaos of his world. Now, every shadow seemed to lengthen. Every distant siren felt like it was screaming his name. The source of his fear wasn't the neighborhood itself, but the ghosts that haunted it. For Darius, the most prominent ghost had a name. Marcus, his older brother. Marcus, who had a smile that could disarm a bomb and a jump shot that was pure poetry. Marcus, who now existed only in faded photographs on his mother's mantelpiece and in the heavy silence that had fallen over their small apartment 3 years ago. The official story was that Marcus had been involved in a gang-related shooting. A deal gone wrong, the police report said. But Darius knew the truth, a truth whispered in hushed tones by neighbors and confirmed by the haunted look in his mother's eyes. Marcus hadn't been a gangbanger. He was a kid who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, a victim of a stray bullet in a war he wasn't fighting. The police had closed the case quickly, too quickly, leaving a wound in their family that refused to heal. That loss had reshaped Darius's world. He'd thrown himself into his studies, building a fortress of academic achievement around his grief. He was going to be different. He was going to get out. Not just for himself, but for Marcus. For his mother, who worked double shifts as a nurse, her exhaustion a constant, silent reproach. He was their second chance, their hope for a life beyond the reach of stray bullets and hasty police reports. As he turned onto his street, the familiar sight of his apartment building came into view. He saw a police cruiser parked at the curb, its presence an immediate knot in his stomach. It was always there, a constant reminder of the power that had failed his brother. Officer Miller was leaning against the car, chatting with a neighbor. Miller, with his polished badge and condescending smile, was a fixture in the neighborhood, a self-proclaimed guardian who seemed to see every young black man as a potential suspect. Darius had had his own run-ins with Miller. A stop and frisk on his way home from school, his backpack emptied onto the sidewalk, its contents, textbooks, a half-eaten apple, a well-worn copy of the autobiography of Malcolm X, splayed out for the world to see. Another time, Miller had accused him of loitering while he was waiting for the bus, his questions laced with a venomous insinuation that Darius was up to no good. Each encounter left him feeling smaller, angrier, the injustice of it a bitter pill to swallow. He tried to walk past, to melt into the shadows of the building, but Miller's eyes snapped to him, a predator spotting its prey. "Well, well, look what we have here," Miller said, his voice dripping with mock cordiality. "Darius Jackson, the boy genius. Out a little late, aren't we?" Darius's hands curled into fists inside his pockets. "I was at the library, officer," he said, his voice tight. Miller pushed himself off the car, his boots crunching on the gravel. He was a big man, his bulk amplified by the uniform and the gun on his hip. He invaded Darius's personal space, his breath a sour mix of coffee and cigarettes. "The library, huh? Or were you out tagging walls like your friends?" "I don't have friends who do that," Darius said, his jaw clenched. Miller's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I'm sure. You're a regular saint, aren't you? Just like your brother." The mention of Marcus was a physical blow. The air rushed out of Darius's lungs, the world tilting on its axis. He could feel the heat rising in his cheeks, the familiar sting of tears he refused to shed. He said nothing, knowing that any response would only fuel Miller's cruelty. "That's what I thought," Miller sneered, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You think you're better than everyone else, with your books and your big words. But I know your kind. It's only a matter of time before you show your true colors." He clapped Darius on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to be friendly but felt like a threat. "Go on home, kid, and stay out of trouble." Darius stumbled away, his legs trembling. He didn't look back, but he could feel Miller's eyes on him, a physical weight on his back. He fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely fit the key in the lock. When he finally got inside, he leaned against the door, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His mother was in the kitchen, her back to him. The smell of garlic and tomatoes filled the small apartment, a stark contrast to the poison he'd just ingested. She turned, her face etched with a familiar worry. "Darius, you're late. Is everything okay?" He wanted to tell her. He wanted to unload the weight of Miller's words, the suffocating injustice of it all. But he couldn't. He couldn't add another burden to her already heavy load. So he forced a smile, a brittle thing that felt like it would shatter. "Yeah, Ma, everything's fine. Just got caught up at the library." She looked at him, her eyes searching his, and for a moment he thought she could see right through him, to the fear and the anger and the ghost of his brother that he carried with him every day. But then she just nodded, her smile as tired as his felt. "Okay, baby, wash up. Dinner's almost ready." As he walked to his room, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the hallway mirror. He saw a scared kid, his eyes wide with a fear he was trying desperately to hide. He saw his brother's face superimposed over his own, a haunting reminder of what he had lost and what he was so afraid of becoming. Another statistic, another name on a police report, another ghost haunting the streets of the South Side. And in that moment, he knew, with a chilling certainty, that his encounter with Officer Miller was not just a random act of harassment. It was a prelude, a warning. And the silence he was keeping was a dangerous thing. The week that followed was a masterclass in avoidance. Darius mapped his routes to and from school like a military strategist, taking longer, more convoluted paths to avoid the streets he knew Officer Miller patrolled. He stayed later at the library, the silence of the stacks a welcome reprieve from the noise in his head. He became a ghost in his own neighborhood, a shadow flitting through the periphery. But fear has a way of finding you. It seeped into the cracks of his carefully constructed routine, a slow poison. He'd see a police cruiser, and his heart would leap into his throat. He'd hear a siren in the distance, and the ghost of his brother would whisper in his ear. The fortress he'd built around himself was beginning to crumble, brick by brick. The breaking point came on a Friday night. His mother had picked up an extra shift at the hospital, the lure of overtime pay a constant necessity. The apartment was empty, the silence amplifying his anxiety. He tried to study, but the words on the page blurred into a meaningless jumble. He needed to move, to escape the confines of the four walls that were closing in on him. He decided to go to the corner store for a soda, a simple act of normalcy in a world that felt anything but. The night air was cool, a welcome relief from the stuffiness of the apartment. The streets were quiet, the usual Friday night energy subdued. He kept his head down, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his senses on high alert. He was halfway to the store when he saw them. A group of older boys, their faces obscured by the shadows of a narrow alley. He recognized one of them, a kid named Jamal, who'd been in a few of his classes before he'd dropped out. They were passing something back and forth, their laughter sharp and brittle in the quiet night. Darius's first instinct was to turn back, to retreat to the relative safety of his apartment. But something held him there, a morbid curiosity, a desire to understand the world that had swallowed his brother whole. He watched from a distance, his heart a slow, heavy drum in his chest. He didn't see the car until it was too late. It came out of nowhere, its headlights off, a dark shark gliding through the concrete jungle. It screeched to a halt at the mouth of the alley, its doors flying open. Two figures emerged, their faces masked, their movements swift and practiced. The world exploded in a cacophony of shouts and screams. The boys in the alley scattered like pigeons, their bravado evaporating in an instant. Darius was frozen, his feet rooted to the spot. He saw the glint of metal in the masked figure's hands, the flash of a muzzle, the pop-pop-pop of a gun that was deafening in the enclosed space. He saw Jamal go down, his body crumpling like a puppet with its strings cut. He saw the masked figures grab a backpack from one of the other boys, their movements efficient and ruthless. And then, as quickly as they had appeared, they were gone, their car peeling out, its tires screaming in protest. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the noise. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the sound of a single agonized groan from the alley. Darius's mind was a whirlwind of panic and adrenaline. He knew he should run. He knew he should call the police. But he was paralyzed, his body refusing to obey the frantic commands of his brain. He took a tentative step towards the alley, his heart pounding in his ears. He had to help. He had to do something. He pulled out his phone, his fingers fumbling with the screen as he tried to dial 911. That's when he heard the siren. It was close. Too close. A police cruiser rounded the corner, its red and blue lights painting the street in strobing, surreal colors. It screeched to a halt, the same spot where the other car had been just moments before. And out of the driver's side stepped Officer Miller. For a moment, Darius felt a wave of relief. The police were here. They would help. But then he saw Miller's eyes, and the relief curdled into a cold, hard knot of fear. Miller wasn't looking at the alley. He was looking at Darius. "Well, well, well," Miller said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Look what the cat dragged in." He started towards Darius, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. "What's in the bag, kid?" Darius was speechless. The phone was still in his hand, the 911 call incomplete. He looked from Miller to the alley, where Jamal was still groaning, his life bleeding out onto the dirty pavement. "There's a guy in there," Darius stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "He's been shot." Miller didn't even glance at the alley. His eyes were fixed on Darius, a predatory gleam in them. "I'll ask you one more time, kid. What's in the bag?" Before Darius could answer, another officer was on him, grabbing his backpack, wrenching it from his shoulders. He was pushed against the wall, his face scraping against the rough brick. He felt the cold metal of handcuffs on his wrists, the click of the lock a sound of finality. "What are you doing?" he cried, his voice a mixture of confusion and terror. "I didn't do anything." Miller was in his face now, his breath hot and foul. "You were at the scene of a crime, kid. That makes you a suspect." He watched as the other officer emptied his backpack onto the hood of the cruiser. His calculus textbook, his notes, his half-eaten bag of chips. And then something else. A small plastic bag filled with white powder. Darius's world tilted. He stared at the bag, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. It wasn't his. He'd never seen it before in his life. "What is that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Miller picked up the bag, a triumphant smirk on his face. "Looks like we got ourselves a drug dealer, boys." He held the bag up for the other officers to see, the plastic glinting in the strobing lights. "And what's this?" he said, pulling a gun from the waistband of Darius's jeans. A gun Darius had never seen before. A gun that wasn't his. The world dissolved into a blur of flashing lights and shouting voices. He was shoved into the back of the cruiser, his head hitting the plexiglass divider. He saw them finally go to the alley, their movements slow, unhurried. He saw them pull a sheet over Jamal's body, his life extinguished, his story over. As the cruiser pulled away, he looked out the back window, his neighborhood receding into the distance. He saw the faces of his neighbors, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and fear. He saw the ghost of his brother, standing on the corner, his face a mask of sorrow and regret. And in that moment, Darius knew. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a setup. And Officer Miller was the architect. The injustice of it was a physical weight, crushing the air from his lungs. He was trapped, a fly in a spider's web, and the spider was wearing a badge. The silence he had been keeping had been a mistake. Now he had a new story to tell, but he was afraid no one would believe him. The holding cell was a cage of concrete and steel, the air thick with the stench of sweat, urine, and despair. The fluorescent lights hummed a monotonous, maddening tune, a soundtrack to the slow-motion nightmare that had become Darius's life. He sat on the cold metal bench, the ghost of the handcuffs still on his wrists, his mind a chaotic whirlwind of fear and disbelief. He replayed the events of the alley over and over, each detail a fresh stab of betrayal. The planted drugs, the gun he'd never seen before. Miller's triumphant smirk. It was a frame job, so blatant, so audacious, it was almost unbelievable. But it was happening. And it was happening to him. The hours bled into one another, a seamless gray expanse of time. He was interrogated by 2 detectives, their questions a relentless barrage of accusations. They didn't want to hear his story. They had their own narrative, a neat, tidy story of a drug deal gone wrong, with Darius as the convenient villain. "We know you were there to buy drugs, Darius," the older detective said, his voice a gravelly mix of disappointment and contempt. "Just tell us who the shooter was, and maybe we can help you." "I wasn't buying drugs," Darius insisted, his voice hoarse. "I was going to the store. I saw what happened. It was 2 guys in masks." The younger detective laughed, a short, sharp bark of a sound. "Sure, kid. And I'm the Tooth Fairy. We found the drugs and the gun on you. It's an open and shut case." They showed him a picture of Jamal, his face pale and lifeless on a metal slab. "This kid is dead, Darius, and right now you're the one who's going to pay for it." The image of Jamal burned itself into his brain, another ghost to add to his collection. He was no longer just a kid who'd been in a few of his classes. He was a victim, a life extinguished, and they were trying to use his death to bury Darius. His mother arrived in a flurry of tears and frantic questions. She looked smaller, more fragile than he'd ever seen her, her nurse's uniform wrinkled, her face a mask of anguish. She held his hand through the bars of the cell, her touch a fragile lifeline in the suffocating darkness. "I don't understand, baby," she whispered, her voice choked with sobs. "They're saying you had a gun. They're saying you had drugs. It's not true, is it?" "No, Ma," he said, his own tears finally breaking free. "It's not true. It was Miller. He planted it on me." She looked at him, her eyes wide with a fear he recognized as his own. She knew about Miller. She knew about the harassment, the constant, low-level intimidation. But this was different. This was a whole new level of evil. "We'll fight this, Darius," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of its usual strength. "We'll get you a lawyer. We'll tell them the truth." But the truth felt like a fragile, insignificant thing in the face of the mountain of lies they were building against him. The system, he was quickly learning, was not designed to find the truth. It was designed to process, to categorize, to close cases. And he was just another case file, another number in a long line of statistics. He was assigned a public defender, a young, overworked woman named Sarah, whose exhaustion was palpable. She listened to his story, her expression a mixture of sympathy and skepticism. "It's his word against a decorated police officer, Darius," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "And they have physical evidence. It's not going to be easy." "But the evidence is fake," he insisted, his voice rising in desperation. "Miller planted it." "I believe you," she said, and for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. "But a jury might not. We need more than just your word. We need proof." The days that followed were a blur of legal jargon and crushing despair. He was charged with possession with intent to distribute and felony murder. The charges were so outrageous, so far removed from the reality of his life, that they felt like they were happening to someone else. He was transferred to the county jail, a place where the air was even thicker with hopelessness. He was surrounded by men whose faces were etched with a lifetime of bad choices and bad luck. He was a lamb in a lion's den, his youth and his fear a target on his back. He retreated into himself, the silence of his cell a welcome respite from the noise and the violence of the common areas. He thought about Marcus, about the injustice of his death, the unanswered questions that still haunted their family. He realized now that what had happened to his brother wasn't just a random act of violence. It was a failure of the system, a system that was now coming for him. His mother visited every day, her face a little more worn, her eyes a little more hollow. She brought him books from the library, a small act of defiance, a reminder of the person he was before he became a number in a cage. "We're not giving up, Darius," she would say, her voice a fierce whisper. "We're going to fight this. We're going to get you out of here." But as the days turned into weeks, his hope began to dwindle. The system was a relentless, grinding machine, and he was being crushed in its gears. His bail was set at an impossibly high number, a figure that was as much a joke as it was an insult. He was trapped, and the walls were closing in. The preliminary hearing was a formality, a procedural step on the road to a trial he was almost certain to lose. He sat at the defendant's table, his ill-fitting suit a costume in a play he never wanted to be a part of. He saw Miller in the courtroom, his uniform crisp, his expression a mask of solemn duty. He looked at Darius, a flicker of a smile on his lips, a silent acknowledgement of his victory. The prosecutor laid out the case against him, a neat, compelling narrative of a young drug dealer caught in the act. The drugs, the gun, his presence at the scene, it all fit together. A perfect, damning puzzle. When it was Sarah's turn, she did her best. She argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that there were no witnesses who could place the gun or the drugs in Darius's hands before the police arrived. She tried to introduce Miller's history of harassment, but the judge sustained the prosecutor's objection. It was irrelevant, he said. Character assassination. Darius felt a surge of rage, so potent, so overwhelming, it almost choked him. Irrelevant? Miller's history of targeting him was the whole story. It was the context for everything that had happened. Without it, he was just another kid from the South Side, another statistic, another cliché. The judge ruled that there was enough evidence to proceed to trial. It was a foregone conclusion, but it still felt like a punch to the gut. As he was being led out of the courtroom, he locked eyes with Miller. The officer's smile was wider now, a triumphant, mocking grin that promised a world of pain. In that moment, Darius understood the true nature of the battle he was fighting. It wasn't just about proving his innocence. It was about surviving. It was about refusing to become the ghost they wanted him to be. And as they led him back to his cell, a new resolve began to form in the ashes of his despair. He would not be silent. He would not be broken. He would find a way to make them listen, even if it was the last thing he ever did. The weeks leading up to the trial were a slow, agonizing crawl. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a gnawing, persistent dread. Darius spent his days in the jail's library, poring over law books, trying to make sense of the labyrinthine legal system that had ensnared him. He was no longer just a victim. He was a student of his own destruction. He learned about discovery, about chain of custody, about the myriad ways the truth could be bent and twisted to fit a prosecutor's narrative. He filled notebooks with questions for Sarah, his handwriting a frantic scrawl across the page. He was no longer passive. He was fighting back, in the only way he knew how, with his mind. Sarah, to her credit, was impressed. "You've done your homework," she said during one of their meetings, a rare smile gracing her lips. "You'd make a good lawyer, Darius." The compliment was a bitter pill. A good lawyer. He was supposed to be an engineer, a builder of bridges and skyscrapers. Now he was just trying to build a bridge out of the hell he was in. The turning point, when it came, was not a dramatic courtroom revelation, but a quiet, almost insignificant detail buried deep in the discovery file. It was a single line in a supplementary police report, a report that had been filed 2 days after his arrest. "I was going through the evidence logs," Sarah said, her voice tight with a suppressed excitement. "The gun they found on you. The serial number was filed off." Darius frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means it's a ghost gun," she said, her eyes shining. "Untraceable. The kind of gun that's used in crimes and then discarded. But that's not the interesting part." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The report says the gun was logged into evidence at 11:42 p.m. on the night of your arrest. But the officer who logged it, a desk sergeant named Peterson, his shift didn't start until midnight." Darius's heart began to beat a little faster. So, Sarah said, a slow smile spreading across her face. How could he log a gun into evidence 18 minutes before he was even on duty? It was a small thing, a discrepancy of a few minutes. But in the world of legal procedure, it was a crack in the foundation of the prosecution's case. It was a loose thread, and Sarah was determined to pull it. She filed a motion to suppress the evidence, arguing that the chain of custody had been compromised. The hearing was a tense, technical affair, a battle of legal wits fought in a language that was foreign to Darius. But he understood the stakes. If they could get the gun thrown out, the prosecution's case would be significantly weakened. On the stand, Sergeant Peterson was a bundle of nerves. He was an older man, his uniform a little too tight, his face slick with sweat. He stammered and stuttered his way through the prosecutor's questions, insisting that he had simply made a mistake on the log, a simple clerical error. But under Sarah's relentless cross-examination, his story began to unravel. She produced his time card, a stark, black-and-white confirmation that he had clocked in at exactly 12:00 a.m. She produced the station's security camera footage, which showed him arriving at the station at 11:55 p.m. "So, you're asking this court to believe," Sarah said, her voice dripping with sarcasm, "that in the 5 minutes between your arrival and the official start of your shift, you managed to receive a piece of evidence from a major crime scene, inspect it, and log it into the system, all while making a mistake on the time?" Peterson's face was ashen. He looked to the prosecutor for help, but the prosecutor was staring down at his notes, his jaw clenched. He looked to Officer Miller, who was sitting in the back of the courtroom, his arms crossed, his face a mask of fury. I don't remember," Peterson stammered, his voice barely a whisper. It was enough. The judge, a stern, no-nonsense woman who had seemed immune to Sarah's arguments, leaned forward, her eyes narrowed. "I'm having a hard time believing you, Sergeant," she said, her voice cold. "The chain of custody for this weapon is, at best, sloppy, and at worst, fraudulent. The motion to suppress is granted. The gun is inadmissible." A gasp went through the courtroom. Darius felt a surge of triumph, so powerful it almost lifted him out of his seat. He looked at Sarah, her face flushed with victory. He looked at his mother, who was openly weeping in the gallery. And he looked at Miller, whose face was a thundercloud of rage. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The drug charge was still hanging over his head, a heavy, suffocating weight. But for the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of hope. The system wasn't just a machine of destruction. It was also a system of rules, of procedures, of checks and balances. And for the first time, it seemed to be working in his favor. The victory, however small, had a profound effect on Darius. It was a validation of his own instincts, a confirmation that he wasn't crazy, that he wasn't just another paranoid kid from the South Side. He had been wronged. And now, there was a chance, however slim, that he could prove it. The experience also ignited a new passion in him. He was no longer just a student of his own case. He was a student of the law. He devoured the books Sarah brought him, his mind sharp, his focus absolute. He learned about precedent, about case law, about the long, slow arc of justice. He started helping other inmates with their cases, his small cell becoming an impromptu legal clinic. He wrote letters to their families, helped them file motions, explained the arcane language of the law in terms they could understand. He was no longer just fighting for himself. He was fighting for them, for all the forgotten, the marginalized, the voiceless. He was still a prisoner, still trapped in a cage of concrete and steel. But his mind was free. And for the first time since that night in the alley, he felt a sense of purpose, a sense of power. He was no longer just a victim, he was a warrior, and he was just beginning to fight. The trial began on a sweltering Monday in August. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with a palpable tension. The local news had picked up the story, a human interest piece about a promising young student caught in the crosshairs of the justice system. The inadmissible gun had made headlines, casting a shadow of doubt on the prosecution's case. Darius sat beside Sarah, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He felt a strange sense of calm, the eye of the hurricane. The fear was still there, a cold knot in the pit of his stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, burning resolve. He was ready. The prosecution's case was, as expected, built on a foundation of circumstantial evidence and innuendo. They painted a picture of Darius as a troubled kid from a bad neighborhood, a wolf in sheep's clothing. They brought in teachers who testified to his quiet, withdrawn nature, twisting his shyness into a sign of a hidden, sinister personality. They brought in Officer Miller, who took the stand with a confident, almost arrogant air. He recounted the events of that night in the alley, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone. He was the hero of his own story, the brave officer who had single-handedly taken a dangerous drug dealer off the streets. Under Sarah's cross-examination, however, his composure began to crack. She grilled him about his history with Darius, about the stop and frisk, the accusations of loitering. She brought up his disciplinary record, which included several complaints of harassment, all of them dismissed. "Isn't it true, Officer Miller," Sarah asked, her voice sharp, "that you had a personal vendetta against my client?" "I have a vendetta against criminals," Miller shot back, his face flushing with anger. "And your client is a criminal." The prosecutor objected, and the judge sustained, but the damage was done. The jury was watching, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. The turning point of the trial, however, came from an unexpected source. Sarah had been digging into Miller's past, looking for anything that might explain his animosity towards Darius. She had found something, a ghost from Miller's own past, a story that had been buried for years. She called a new witness to the stand, a woman named Elena Ramirez. She was in her late 40s, her face etched with a deep, abiding sorrow. She walked to the stand with a quiet dignity, her eyes fixed on Officer Miller. "Mrs. Ramirez," Sarah began, her voice gentle, "could you please tell the court how you know Officer Miller?" Elena's eyes never left Miller's. "He was the officer who investigated my son's death," she said, her voice a low, trembling whisper. A murmur went through the courtroom. Miller's face was ashen, his confident demeanor gone, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated panic. "And what was your son's name?" Sarah asked. "His name was Miguel," Elena said, her voice cracking. "He was 16 years old." She told the court about her son, a bright, talented kid who had gotten mixed up with the wrong crowd. He had been killed in a drug deal gone wrong, a story that was eerily similar to the one the prosecution was trying to pin on Darius. "Officer Miller was in charge of the investigation," Elena continued, her voice gaining strength. "He told me he would find the person who killed my son. He promised me justice." She paused, taking a deep, shuddering breath. "But he didn't. He closed the case after 2 weeks. He said there wasn't enough evidence. He said my son was just another gangbanger, that he got what he deserved." The courtroom was silent, the air thick with a shared, unspoken grief. Darius looked at his mother, who was crying silently, her hand covering her mouth. He looked at Miller, who was staring at his hands, his face a mask of shame. "But that's not the whole story, is it, Mrs. Ramirez?" Sarah prodded gently. Elena shook her head. "No. A few months later, an anonymous source sent me a file, a police file. It was the complete record of my son's case, and it was full of lies." She explained that the file contained evidence that Miller had suppressed, witness statements that he had ignored, a description of a getaway car that he had never followed up on, and a name. The name of the person who had been the primary suspect in her son's murder, a person Miller had never even questioned. "And who was that person, Mrs. Ramirez?" Sarah asked, her voice ringing through the silent courtroom. Elena's eyes were burning holes into Miller. "It was his own nephew," she said, her voice a raw, broken cry. "His nephew was the one who killed my son, and he covered it up." The courtroom erupted. The judge banged his gavel, his face a thundercloud of fury. The prosecutor was on his feet, his face pale, his mouth agape. Darius's mind was reeling. Miller's vendetta against him, his obsession with pinning Jamal's murder on him. It all made a sick, twisted kind of sense now. It wasn't just about a personal dislike. It was about a cover-up. He needed a suspect, any suspect, to close the case quickly, to divert attention from his own past, from the ghost of the boy he had failed, the boy whose murder he had helped to conceal. Darius was not just a convenient scapegoat. He was a sacrifice, an offering to the gods of Miller's own guilt and corruption. The injustice of it was staggering, a weight so heavy it threatened to crush him. He looked at Miller, who seemed to have shrunk in his seat, a pathetic, deflated figure. He was no longer a monster, a symbol of a corrupt system. He was just a man, a flawed, broken man who had made a terrible choice and had spent years trying to outrun the consequences. The twist was not just a legal bombshell. It was a human tragedy, a story of 2 mothers, 2 sons, 2 lives destroyed by a single act of corruption. And in that moment, Darius knew that this was no longer just his fight. It was a fight for Marcus, for Jamal, for Miguel, for all the ghosts who haunted the streets of the South Side, their stories untold, their justice denied. The trial was no longer about his freedom. It was about theirs. The revelation of Officer Miller's past hung over the courtroom like a shroud. The trial had been suspended for the day, the judge calling for an immediate investigation into the allegations. The media had descended like vultures, their cameras and microphones a chaotic swarm outside the courthouse. Darius was in a daze. He felt like he had been running a marathon and had just crossed a finish line he didn't even know was there. He was exhausted, but also strangely energized. The truth was out. The ghost of Miguel Ramirez had been given a voice. The next day, the courtroom was even more packed than before. The air was electric, a palpable sense of anticipation. The prosecutor, his face a grim mask, announced that he was dropping the murder charge against Darius. There was a collective gasp, followed by a wave of applause from the gallery. Darius felt a surge of relief so powerful it almost buckled his knees. He looked at his mother, her face a mixture of joy and disbelief. He looked at Sarah, who gave him a small, triumphant smile. But it wasn't over. The drug charge remained. The bag of white powder, the one Miller had found in his backpack, was still a piece of evidence, a stain on his name. The prosecutor, desperate to salvage some semblance of a case, called his final witness. It was the other officer who had been at the scene, a young, nervous-looking man named Henderson. He recounted the events of that night, his testimony a carbon copy of Miller's. He was a loyal soldier, towing the party line. But under Sarah's cross-examination, his composure, like Miller's, began to fray. She asked him about the drugs. "Officer Henderson," she said, her voice calm and measured, "you testified that you found this bag of cocaine in my client's backpack. Is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am," Henderson said, his eyes darting nervously towards the prosecutor. "And you were with Officer Miller the entire time, from the moment you arrived on the scene until the moment you placed my client in the cruiser?" "Yes, ma'am." "So you would have seen Officer Miller plant those drugs, if that's what happened?" The prosecutor leaped to his feet. "Objection! Assumes facts not in evidence." "Sustained," the judge said, his voice weary. "Rephrase the question, counsel." Sarah nodded. "Officer Henderson, at any point during your interaction with my client, did you see him handle that bag of drugs? Did you see him put it in his backpack?" Henderson hesitated. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. He licked his lips, his eyes wide with a fear that was all too familiar to Darius. I don't recall," he finally stammered. It was a weak answer, a transparent lie. But it was enough to create reasonable doubt. Or so Darius hoped. The prosecution rested. It was now the defense's turn. Sarah had a choice to make. She could rest her case, relying on the doubt she had created, on the shadow that now hung over the entire police investigation. Or she could put Darius on the stand. It was a risk, a huge risk. It would open him up to a brutal cross-examination, a character assassination by a desperate prosecutor. But it was also a chance for him to tell his story in his own words, a chance for the jury to see him not as a statistic, not as a defendant, but as a human being. "I want to do it," Darius said, his voice firm. "I need to do it." He took the stand, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He looked out at the sea of faces, at the jury, at his mother, at the ghost of his brother that was always with him. He told his story. He spoke of his love for his brother, of his dream of becoming an engineer. He spoke of his fear of the police, of the constant harassment he had endured. He spoke of that night in the alley, of his terror, of his confusion, of his utter disbelief when he saw the drugs and the gun. He spoke with a quiet eloquence, his voice filled with a raw, honest emotion. He didn't sound like a drug dealer. He sounded like a scared kid who had been caught in a nightmare. The prosecutor's cross-examination was as brutal as they had expected. He twisted Darius's words, tried to paint him as a liar, a manipulator, a criminal. But Darius held his ground. He answered every question with a calm, unwavering certainty. He had the truth on his side, and it was a powerful shield. And then, it was time for the closing arguments. The prosecutor went first, his voice a desperate plea to the jury. He tried to dismiss the revelations about Miller as a distraction, a smokescreen. He held up the bag of drugs, the last remaining piece of his shattered case. "This is what this case is about," he said, his voice ringing with a false conviction. "A young man who made a bad choice. A young man who needs to be held accountable." Then it was Sarah's turn. She walked to the center of the courtroom, her eyes sweeping over the jury. "This case is not about a bad choice," she said, her voice a low, powerful hum. "It is about an abuse of power. It is about a corrupt officer who tried to frame an innocent boy to cover up his own crimes. It is about a system that is all too willing to believe the worst about a young black man from the South Side." She paused, letting her words sink in. "The prosecution wants you to believe that Darius Jackson is a drug dealer, but look at him. Look at this boy, who has spent the last 3 months of his life in a cage, fighting for his life, for his future, for the truth." She turned to Darius, her eyes filled with a fierce, protective fire. "Darius is not a criminal. He is a victim. He is a survivor. And he deserves justice." The judge gave his instructions to the jury. The bailiff led them out of the courtroom. And then, there was nothing but silence. The waiting was the hardest part, a slow, agonizing torture. Every minute felt like an hour, every hour an eternity. Darius sat with his mother and Sarah in a small, windowless room, the silence broken only by the sound of their own breathing. He thought about his future, about the life he had almost lost. He thought about Marcus and Jamal and Miguel, the ghosts who had become his unlikely allies. After what felt like a lifetime, the bailiff returned. "They have a verdict," he said, his voice a flat, emotionless statement. They filed back into the courtroom, the tension so thick it was almost a physical presence. Darius's hands were slick with sweat, his heart pounding so hard he thought it would burst. The jury foreman, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, stood up. She held a piece of paper in her trembling hand. She cleared her throat, her eyes meeting Darius's for a brief, unreadable moment. "On the charge of possession of a controlled substance with intent to distribute," she said, her voice clear and steady, "we the jury find the defendant." She paused, and in that single, heart-stopping moment, Darius's entire life hung in the balance. "Not guilty." The words, "not guilty," echoed in the sudden, profound silence of the courtroom, then were immediately swallowed by an eruption of sound. A wave of gasps, sobs, and shouts washed over the room. Darius felt the air leave his lungs in a rush, as if he'd been holding his breath for 3 months. His mother's arms were around him, her tears soaking the shoulder of his borrowed suit. He buried his face in her embrace, the scent of her perfume a grounding, familiar comfort in the overwhelming chaos. He was free. The weight that had been crushing him, the suffocating shroud of a future stolen, had been lifted. Across the room, he saw Officer Miller being led away in handcuffs. His face was a collapsed mask of disbelief and despair. There was no triumph in seeing him defeated, only a deep, hollow sadness for the lives he had ruined, including his own. The system, for once, had worked. It had bent, it had been pushed, but ultimately it had not broken. It had listened to the voice of a scared teenager, to the ghosts of the forgotten, and it had delivered a fragile, hard-won justice. In the weeks that followed, the world slowly began to reassemble itself. The media frenzy died down, the cameras moved on to the next story, and Darius was left to pick up the pieces of his life. He returned to school, where he was greeted not as a suspect, but as a hero. His classmates, who had once looked at him with a mixture of fear and suspicion, now saw him with a newfound respect. He was no longer the quiet, withdrawn boy in the back of the class. He was the boy who had faced down the system and won, but the victory was not without its scars. The ghosts of Marcus, Jamal, and Miguel were still with him, their stories a constant reminder of the fragility of justice, of the thin line between a life of promise and a life cut short. He could not forget them. He would not forget them. He started a new club at school, a student-led organization dedicated to legal advocacy and social justice. They called it the Ghost Project, a tribute to the forgotten voices they were determined to amplify. They studied cases of wrongful conviction, wrote letters to inmates, and organized community meetings to educate people about their rights. Darius had found a new purpose, a new passion. He was no longer just a student of engineering. He was a student of humanity, a builder of bridges between the powerless and the powerful. He kept in touch with Sarah, who had become more than just his lawyer. She was his mentor, his friend, his guide in the complex, often frustrating world of the law. He spent his afternoons in her office, reading case files, learning the intricacies of the legal system, his mind a sponge for the knowledge she so generously shared. One afternoon, as he was leaving her office, he ran into Elena Ramirez. She was waiting for him in the hallway, her face softer, the deep lines of sorrow around her eyes a little less pronounced. "I wanted to thank you, Darius," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You gave my son a voice. You gave him the justice he was denied." She handed him a small, worn photograph. It was a picture of Miguel, his smile wide and infectious, his eyes full of the same light that had once shone in Marcus's. "I want you to have this," she said. "To remember him." Darius took the photograph, his fingers tracing the outline of the smiling boy. He was not just a ghost anymore. He was a person, a life, a story that deserved to be told. That night, as he sat in his room, the photograph of Miguel beside the one of his brother, he finally understood the true meaning of what had happened. It was not just about his own freedom, his own vindication. It was about the interconnectedness of their stories, the shared struggle for justice in a world that was often unjust. The life lesson was not a simple, easy one. It was not that good always triumphs over evil, or that the system is always fair. It was that the fight for justice is a long, hard, and often lonely one. It is a fight that is won not in a single dramatic moment, but in the small, quiet acts of courage, of persistence, of refusing to be silenced. He had pointed his finger at a man in a position of power, a man who had seemed untouchable. He had spoken his truth, a truth that had been born of pain and loss and a fierce, unyielding love for his brother. And in doing so, he had not only saved himself, but he had also honored the ghosts of the past and had lit a small, flickering candle of hope for the future. He was no longer just a survivor. He was a warrior, and his fight had just begun. The world was still a place of cracked sidewalks and vibrant murals, of rumbling bass and laughing children. But for Darius, it was also a place of purpose, of meaning, of a hard-won peace. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was finally home. Darius's incredible journey is a testament to the power of truth and the courage it takes to speak out against injustice. His story is a reminder that one voice can change everything, and that the fight for what's right is always worth it. If you were moved by his story, please help us share this powerful message. Like this video to show your support, share it with friends and family, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that need to be told. Your engagement helps us bring these important narratives to light. Thank you for watching.